In the dim half-light before dawn, the Pacific seemed to hold its breath. On the flight deck of an American carrier, a young pilot tightened the straps across his shoulders, feeling the vibration of a radial engine waiting to roar. Salt wind cut across the deck. The sky was black, silent, and impossibly wide, an ocean above an ocean. In moments, he would rise into it, searching for an enemy who had dominated these skies for far too long. Just a year earlier, the Japanese Zero had made every US Navy fighter feel obsolete. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and dictate the rhythm of the Pacific Air War. American pilots knew the rules. Never turn with a zero, never linger, never make a mistake. Yet men were dying even when they followed doctrine. Something had to change. And so one morning, in April 1942, a Medal of Honor pilot walked into the Grumman factory, carrying the truth about survival, what worked, what failed, and what was needed next. His briefing would ignite a transformation that reshaped World War II naval aviation, leading to the creation of an aircraft that turned fear into control and retreat into dominance. This is the story of the F6F Hellcat fighter that changed everything. By early 1942, American pilots in the Pacific were fighting a war their aircraft could not win. The F4F Wildcat, the standard US Navy fighter at the time, was sturdy and loyal, but it was outclassed. Every engagement with the Japanese Zero exposed the crushing truth. The Wildcat could not climb as fast, could not turn as tight, and could not escape once caught inside the Zero's lethal turning circle. In horizontal combat, a Zero could carve a full circle in half the time a Wildcat needed. That difference was measured in seconds. Seconds that decided who lived and who did not. Doctrine tried to compensate. Pilots were told to strike fast, dive away, and never under any circumstances attempt to turn with a zero. But doctrine collapses when machinery cannot keep pace with reality. In the chaos of the Pacific Air War, Wildcat pilots found themselves pulled into turning fights they couldn't avoid or chased in climbs they couldn't outpace. And too often, they never came home. The loss of Lieutenant James Gray made that reality impossible to ignore. Gray was disciplined, experienced, and calm under pressure, the kind of flyer whose judgment others trusted implicitly. On February 21st, 1942, he followed doctrine exactly. He dove with speed, fired a clean deflection shot, and began climbing out just as trained. But the Wildcat's engine simply could not deliver the power he needed. A Zero reversed dove and struck him down before he could reach safety. His wingman reported that everything Gray did was correct except the airplane he flew. Men like Gray were dying, not because they were unskilled, but because they were trapped in machines a generation behind their enemy. Edward Butch OHare understood this better than anyone. He had already earned the Medal of Honor by defending the carrier Lexington shooting down 5 bombers in a single engagement. He had survived 14 missions. And in ready rooms across the Pacific, he had watched 17 fellow pilots disappear, some close friends, others only familiar voices on the radio, each loss carving a deeper urgency into his understanding of the war. OHare knew the Wildcat's virtues. It could absorb punishment the Japanese Zero never could. It carried heavy 50 caliber machine guns with deep ammunition stores. It protected the pilot well. But none of that mattered if American fighters could not seize or escape a fight at will. Strength was useless without the power to choose the moment of battle. That is why, on April 22, 1942, OHare walked into the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, carrying everything he had learned in the brutal calculus of the Pacific Air War. He was met by William Schwendler, a veteran engineer shaping the next generation of World War II naval aviation. Their meeting was not ceremonial. It was a transfer of survival, 4 hours of raw data from a man who had lived the fight to a team capable of building the machine that could change it. For the first time, engineers heard exactly what combat demanded: greater power, better visibility, faster climbs, safer landings. An aircraft that could not merely match the Japanese Zero, but surpass it. It was here in that quiet room on Long Island that the idea of the F6F Hellcat took form, not as a concept on paper, but as a lifeline for pilots who needed a fighting chance. The meeting between OHare and William Schwendler did not fade into another wartime memo. 4 days later, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a directive that transformed a promising prototype into a decisive weapon. The new fighter would receive the massive Pratt and Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine, so an horsepower of raw force. The cockpit would sit higher for unobstructed visibility. Hydraulic landing gear would replace the dangerous hand-cranked system of the Wildcat. Armor protection would increase wherever the structure could bear it. Every change reflected combat reality, not theory. Schwendler's team worked with a sense of urgency found only in wartime engineering. The airframe was reinforced, control surfaces refined, and the entire forward fuselage reshaped to house the enormous engine. When the F6F finally took to the skies in July 1942, test pilot Robert Hall returned after 45 minutes with a verdict that carried the weight of the future. It flies like a Wildcat with twice the power. Cooling issues, landing gear timing, and gun synchronization still required refinement, but these were solvable problems. And they were solved quickly. By the end of 1942, the first production F6F Hellcat rolled out of Grumman's rapidly expanding Bethpage plant. The factory ran around the clock, building aircraft faster than the Navy could train men to fly them. In early 1943, Fighting Squadron 9VF9 received its first Hellcats at Naval Air Station Norfolk. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey, had flown Wildcats in combat and knew better than most what it meant to be outmatched by a Japanese Zero. The first time he walked around a Hellcat, he understood immediately the balance of the Pacific Air War had shifted before the aircraft had even fired a shot. The Hellcat was larger, heavier, and more powerful than the Wildcat. Yet pilots found it easier to fly. The hydraulic landing gear removed a dangerous burden. Visibility was vastly improved. And when they advanced the throttle, the R-2800 answered with the kind of authority pilots had been begging for since 1942. For the first time, ordinary aviators, not just the asses, felt they had margin maneuverability and the ability to dictate the fight. Training lasted 5 months. Gunnery practice intensified. Formation drills sharpened. Carrier landings became smoother. Pilots learned to manage higher approach speeds and heavier loads, but they did so with confidence. The aircraft's strength and stability gave them room to learn to adjust to survive. On August 31st, 1943, VF-9 launched from the carrier Essex in the pre-dawn dark. They formed up with fighters from Yorktown and Independence, the first carrier group in history equipped entirely with Hellcats. The target was Marcus Island, a fortified Japanese outpost guarding a remote corner of the Pacific. As the sun rose behind them, the Hellcats dove with speed the Wildcat could never have achieved. Anti-aircraft guns barked from below, but they were too slow to stop the attack. 6 aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the opening minutes. Fuel depots erupted. Radar towers collapsed. And for the first time in the war, American carrier fighters struck a Japanese base without losing the air. Marcus Island was not a large battle, but its meaning was enormous. The Hellcat had entered combat, and it had entered as a predator. The era of retreat was over. A new chapter in World War II naval aviation had begun. The debut of the F6F Hellcat at Marcus Island proved that American pilots finally had a machine worthy of the fight. But the true test came in the battles that followed. Moments when the Hellcat met the Japanese Zero in open combat and rewrote the rhythm of the Pacific Air War. In September 1943, Hellcats from the carrier Independence intercepted a Japanese flying boat near Howland and Baker Islands. It was a small engagement, two American pilots coordinating to bring down a single aircraft, but it marked the Hellcats' first aerial victory. A month later, during the raid on Wake Island, they faced 34 Zeros. The fight was sharp and violent. When it ended, 22 Japanese fighters had fallen against 6 Hellcats, lost a ratio far superior to anything the Wildcat had ever achieved. Then came Kwajalein Atoll. On December 4th, 1943, 91 Hellcats from 3 carriers encountered 50 Zeros defending the lagoon. The Japanese pilots fought with the same aggressive tactics that had devastated American formations for 2 years, diving from above, baiting turns, forcing climbs. But this time, those tactics failed. The Hellcat climbed away from danger. It dove with greater speed. It held energy longer, absorbed more punishment, and delivered heavier blows. In 37 minutes of combat, the Hellcats shot down 28 Zeros. Only 2 American fighters were lost. For the first time, the performance gap had reversed. The hunter had become the hunted. Yet, even in triumph, the war delivered its own cruelty. On November 26, 1943, just weeks before the success at Kwajalein, Edward Butch OHare launched from the carrier Enterprise on a night interception mission. He flew a Hellcat into darkness, experimenting with new tactics that paired fighters with radar-equipped torpedo bombers. The formation engaged Japanese aircraft that night, but OHare never reappeared. His radio went silent. Search planes found nothing. He was declared missing in action, presumed dead at age 30. The man whose insight had shaped the Hellcat would never see the aircraft rise to its full power. He would never see its 19-to-1 kill ratio, its dominance over the Japanese Zero, or its status as the backbone of World War II naval aviation. His absence became a quiet shadow behind every victory the Hellcat earned. The greatest test came 6 months later, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944. 15 American carriers launched nearly 500 Hellcats against 9 Japanese carriers, whose air groups were thin, undertrained, and flying designs optimized for a war that no longer existed. The Japanese sent 4 massive raids toward the American fleet. Hellcats intercepted each one before the bombers reached their targets. The result was shockingly one-sided: more than 200 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. Only 29 American aircraft were lost, most to anti-aircraft fire. Pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the most lopsided aerial battle in naval history. Later that year, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 10, faced overwhelming numbers. With his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, he dove into a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell shot down 9, becoming an ace in a day for the second time, while Rushing added 6 more. They returned to the carrier nearly out of fuel and ammunition engines, sputtering decks, prepared for the worst. Their victory became a symbol of what the Hellcat had enabled: superb pilots, equipped with an aircraft that gave them room to fight, to adapt, and to survive. By the end of 1944, the Hellcat was no longer just a U.S. Navy fighter. It was the instrument through which America seized control of the Pacific Air War and never relinquished it. From the American perspective, the success of the F6F Hellcat was more than a triumph of machinery. It was a turning point in how the United States understood aerial warfare. Before the Hellcat victory in the sky depended heavily on exceptional pilotsmen like OHare Thatch and other early aces who survived through instinct, discipline, and luck. But wars are not won by the exceptional alone. They are won by systems that allow ordinary men to do extraordinary things. That is where the Hellcat changed everything. The aircraft was built not for the elite few, but for the many, for the young aviators who had barely completed advanced training, for the reservists pulled into service for pilots who would face the unforgiving realities of the Pacific Air War with only weeks of preparation. The Hellcat gave them what the Wildcat never could, though: power, forgiveness, and a second chance when mistakes were made. Its rugged construction and superior climb rate allowed even average flyers to counter the Japanese Zero, transforming survival from a rarity into an expectation. To American strategists, this transformation became a case study in rapid wartime innovation. The Navy had listened to engineers, to frontline pilots, to the hard numbers that told of aircraft lost and men who weren't coming home. In doing so, they accelerated a design cycle that normally took years into mere months. It was a lesson in institutional humility. Victory required accepting that the enemy had built a better fighter, and that only bold, immediate change could close the gap. From the Japanese perspective, the emergence of the Hellcat marked the beginning of a crisis that could not be reversed. Their aviation doctrine had been built around the strengths of the Japanese Zero, lightweight, highly maneuverable and devastating in the hands of elite pilots. But by 1944, those elite pilots were largely gone sacrificed in the Solomon Islands and at Midway. Their replacements, trained in haste, were sent into battle against a sturdier, faster, more powerful opponent, designed explicitly to counter their tactics. The result was catastrophic. Cautious pilots surrendered the initiative. Aggressive pilots gambled and lost. Neither approach could stop the momentum of a US Navy fighter, optimized for a new era of air combat. Looking back, historians often describe the Hellcat as the embodiment of American industrial power. But its true legacy is deeper. It proved that technology must evolve with the battlefield, that the survival of pilots depends on the willingness of nations to rethink, redesign, and relearn under fire. And in the broader story of World War II naval aviation, the Hellcat stands as a reminder: air superiority is never guaranteed. It must be built flight by flight, decision by decision, in the narrow space between innovation and sacrifice. Long after the engines fell silent and the carriers returned to port, the legacy of the F6F Hellcat endured, written not just in kill ratios or production numbers, but in the lives it preserved and the future it shaped. By the end of the war, Grumman had built 12 Tu-75 Hellcats. They achieved an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio, accounting for nearly 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific. 306 pilots became aces in its cockpit, and only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat during the entire conflict. Yet, the aircraft's significance extends far beyond the statistics. In museums across the United States, most famously in Pensacola, where David McCampbell's Mincy III stands, restored visitors can walk beneath the broad blue wings that once carried young Americans into the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Air War. 7 Hellcats still fly today, their engines echoing across air shows as living reminders of a time when the outcome of World War II naval aviation hung in the balance. The human story behind this machine is even more profound. Butch OHare never saw the fighter he helped design dominate the skies. He never witnessed its victories at the Philippine Sea or its success against the Japanese Zero. His final flight ended in darkness, his fate unknown, and yet his legacy lives on in the airport that bears his name in the Wildcat displayed in Chicago, with Japanese flags marking his triumphs, and in every Hellcat that took flight with the improvements born from his 4-hour meeting at Grumman. William Schwendler, the engineer who listened so carefully, never became a household name, but his work shaped the future of the US Navy fighter. David McCampbell, the nation's top naval ace, carried that legacy into battle, proving what could happen when skilled pilots were given the aircraft they deserved. Together, their stories form a single truth victory. In war is not the result of chance or heroism alone, but of learning, honest, urgent, and often paid for in blood. And as the last surviving Hellcats lift into the modern sky, they remind us that the struggle for air superiority is timeless. The lessons of their creation, humility, adaptation, and the courage to change remain as relevant today as they were in 1942. Before we close this chapter, I'd like to hear from you. What do you believe is the greatest lesson from the Hellcats' emergence over the Pacific? Share your thoughts. Below, your perspective keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching and for honoring the history carried on the wings of the F6F Hellcat.